Last Saturday was a day I'll never forget. My husband, the man I thought I could trust, sat me down and delivered a life-altering confession. He told me that 9 years ago, during what I thought was a strong period in our marriage, he had an affair. As if that wasn't enough, he dropped an even bigger bombshell. The affair had resulted in a child, a 9-year-old girl. I barely had time to process this betrayal before he hit me with more shocking news. The girl's mother had recently passed away, or something had happened to her. I admit, I didn't fully catch the details. My world was spinning, and I was too busy screaming at him to absorb everything he was saying. All I knew was that this child, a living reminder of his infidelity, was suddenly being brought into our lives. He explained that he was leaving immediately to pick her up and bring her to live with us. There was no conversation, no plan, no consultation with me or our children. It was just happening, as though it was entirely his decision to make. Our kids, our 14-year-old son and 10-year-old daughter, were as blindsided as I was. They had no idea about the affair or this child, and now they were being told their lives were going to change overnight. My daughter, in particular, was heartbroken. She came to me in tears, barely able to speak, saying that my husband told her she'd have to share her bedroom and her belongings with this new child. Her bedroom is her sanctuary. It's where she keeps her books, toys, and all the things that make her feel safe and at home. To ask her to give that up, especially for someone she'd never met and under such emotionally fraught circumstances, felt like too much. She looked at me with tearful, pleading eyes, and I knew I couldn't let this happen to her. At that moment, the weight of my husband's betrayal hit me in full force. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about how his choices were affecting everyone around him. My children and I were expected to adapt to his decisions without question, even though we were the ones being hurt the most. And just like that, I realized I needed to protect my kids, especially my daughter, from being further uprooted by his selfishness. I didn't have a clear plan yet, but I knew I couldn't sit back and let him destroy what little stability we had left. The moment my daughter came to me in tears, something inside me snapped. Her sobs were raw and full of confusion, fear, and betrayal. My husband, her own father, had just told her she needed to give up her space, her belongings, and her sense of security for a stranger. No, not just any stranger. A stranger who was the living embodiment of his betrayal. After comforting her as best I could, I realized I had to act quickly. My daughter needed stability and safety, and if she couldn't have that in her own home, I would find it elsewhere. My first thought was to call my parents. They've always been the kind of people who'd drop everything to support their grandchildren, and this time was no exception. Without hesitation, they offered their guest room for my daughter to stay in as long as she needed. As I hung up the phone, a surge of determination washed over me. I wasn't just protecting my daughter from losing her room. I was shielding her from the emotional chaos my husband had unleashed. That same evening, I called my sister, who immediately rallied her family to help. By Monday morning, my parents, my sister, her husband, and even my nephew showed up at our house, ready to help move my daughter's belongings. We worked in quiet solidarity, packing up her clothes, toys, books, and every little piece of comfort she had built for herself. It felt bittersweet. On one hand, I was proud of how my family had come together to support us. On the other, I couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. This shouldn't have been necessary. My husband should have protected our daughter, but instead, he was too busy playing hero for a child he'd hidden from us for 9 years. When we got to my parents' condo, my dad had already cleared the guest room and made it cozy for my daughter. My mom had stocked the fridge with her favorite snacks, and my sister had brought over a small bookshelf to make the space feel more like home. Seeing my daughter smile, albeit through tears, felt like a small victory. But I wasn't done. Back at the house, I knew I had to protect the rest of us, too. My son had been eerily quiet throughout this ordeal, which worried me. At 14, he was old enough to understand the implications of what was happening, but young enough to feel powerless against it. I couldn't let him feel like his space or security was in jeopardy. With my family's help, we installed locks on both my son's bedroom door and mine. I couldn't risk my husband forcing us to compromise our personal spaces, not when he was so fixated on this new family dynamic he had thrust upon us. Then I turned my attention to my bedroom. The thought of sleeping in the same bed where my husband and I had once shared dreams and plans felt unbearable. I needed to reclaim my space, my autonomy. Every drawer, every shelf, every trace of him, I packed it all up and moved it into the small fourth bedroom he used as a home office. It wasn't much, but it was enough for him. He had made his choices, and now he would have to live with them, away from me. By the time we finished, the house felt different. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a battleground. But at least my children and I had carved out small corners of safety amidst the chaos. As I closed the door to my daughter's now empty bedroom that night, I felt a pang of sadness. Her laughter, her chatter, the sound of her singing along to her favorite songs, it all felt like it had been ripped away. But I knew this was the right decision. She needed a safe space to heal, away from the shadow of her father's choices. My husband hadn't even returned yet, but his presence loomed large. I could already feel the tension brewing, the storm that would erupt the moment he realized what I'd done. Still, I didn't care. For once, I wasn't worrying about what he wanted or how he would react. This was about my kids. This was about protecting what little peace we had left. The next day, I braced myself for what was to come. My husband would come home to a house he wouldn't recognize, a house that no longer revolved around him and his decisions. And I was ready for the fight. Tuesday evening, the front door creaked open, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. My husband was home. My heart pounded as I braced for the inevitable clash. Then I heard her voice, a soft, hesitant voice of a child who didn't yet understand the storm she was walking into. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with dinner, but I could hear everything. My husband led his daughter into the house, his voice unnaturally cheerful as he tried to make her feel welcome. "This is your new home," he said, his tone thick with forced enthusiasm. But then there was a pause, a long, suffocating silence. I knew he had reached my daughter's empty bedroom. "What the hell?" His voice boomed through the house, laced with shock and anger. "Where is everything?" I stepped out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on a towel, trying to project calm even as I felt the storm brewing inside me. "She's staying at my parents' house," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I moved her things there." His face turned red, veins bulging at his temples. "You moved her out? Without even discussing it with me?" I crossed my arms, meeting his glare with unwavering resolve. "You didn't discuss bringing your affair child into this house, so why should I?" His daughter stood behind him, clutching a small, worn backpack and staring at her feet. My anger wasn't directed at her, but it was impossible to ignore the ripple effects of her presence. This wasn't her fault, and yet here she was, caught in the crossfire of a mess she didn't create. "She's a child," my husband hissed, his voice dropping into a low growl. "She's been through enough already. And now you're being cruel by refusing to make space for her. She doesn't even have clothes for this weather." "That's not my fault," I snapped back. "You had 9 years to prepare for this, and you didn't. You kept her a secret, and now you expect me and our kids to upend our lives because of your mistakes." His daughter shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between us. I softened my tone and turned to her. "Sweetheart, none of this is your fault. You don't deserve to be in the middle of this." Her lips quivered, but she didn't say a word. My husband, however, wasn't ready to back down. "You're heartless," he spat. "This is her home now, and you're acting like she doesn't belong here." "Belong here?" I repeated, incredulous. "You didn't even give us a chance to adjust. You didn't ask how our kids felt, how this would affect them. You just decided on your own to bring her here and expect us to fall in line." He shook his head, his anger morphing into something more calculated. "You've always been selfish, haven't you? This is about punishing me, not about protecting the kids." I felt the sting of his words, but refused to let them sink in. "This isn't about punishment. This is about shielding our children from the chaos you've created. Our daughter was in tears because you told her she had to give up her room and her things for a stranger. Do Do you even realize how unfair that is to her? Or are you so focused on saving face that you can't see the damage you're doing to your family? He opened his mouth to argue, but was interrupted by our son, who had been quietly listening from the hallway. "She's right, Dad," he said, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "You didn't think about us at all. You just dumped this on us like it's no big deal." The weight of my son's words seemed to deflate my husband, if only slightly. He looked at him, then at me, and finally at his daughter. The girl looked so small, so fragile, standing there in the middle of this war zone. "Fine," he muttered under his breath, grabbing the bags he'd brought in. "We'll figure something out." He turned and stormed down the hall to his home office, the same room I had moved all his belongings into. His daughter lingered in the doorway, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "You're not mad at me, are you?" she asked softly. I knelt down to her level, my heart aching for her. "No, honey," I said gently. "None of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." She gave me a timid nod and followed my husband down the hall, her small frame swallowed by the tension in the air. As I watched her disappear, I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anger and betrayal burning inside me. This was the reality my husband had forced upon us. He had made his choices, and now we were all left to deal with the fallout. But I would be damned if I let him bulldoze over me or our children any further. The house fell silent again, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that came before the next wave of the storm. And I knew it was far from over. The house was a powder keg. After my husband retreated to his makeshift bedroom, slamming the door behind him, I stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter to steady myself. My son quietly slipped back to his room, leaving me alone in the eerie silence. I couldn't even process what had just happened. The image of that little girl, so fragile, so lost, kept flashing in my mind. Her wide, uncertain eyes, her trembling voice. I wasn't angry at her. I was angry at him. How could he do this? How could he drag her into this mess without a shred of consideration for the chaos it would unleash on everyone? Later that evening, I found myself pacing the hallway, passing by the doors of the rooms that now seemed to tell a story of division. My son's room was locked. My room was locked. And down the hall, behind a door that used to hold my husband's office, were two people trying to figure out how to coexist in a house that felt more like a battlefield. Just as I was about to retreat to my own room, I heard his door open. My husband emerged, his face drawn tight with frustration and exhaustion. He spotted me immediately, and I could see the anger brewing behind his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. I crossed my arms, already on the defensive. "About what?" "You've made it clear you'll do whatever you want, no matter how it affects anyone else." He pinched the bridge of his nose, his voice lowering into something meant to sound reasonable but only came across as patronizing. "I get that you're upset. I understand that this is hard for you. Hard for me." I cut him off, my voice rising. "What about our kids? What about them? Did you even consider how this would turn their lives upside down? Or were you too busy playing the savior to think about what they need?" He shook his head, his hands on his hips. "She's my daughter. She's part of this family now, whether you like it or not. I couldn't just leave her to fend for herself." "No one is asking you to abandon her," I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. "But you can't expect us to rearrange our lives overnight because of your lies. You had 9 years to prepare for this. 9 years to tell me the truth. Instead, you dumped it on us like a bomb, and now you're surprised that the shrapnel is cutting everyone." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't understand what she's been through. She lost her mother. She has no one else. And whose fault is that?" I hissed, my voice shaking now. "You built this situation with your lies and your selfishness. Don't you dare make me the villain for protecting our kids when you're the one who put us here." His face hardened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to yell again. Instead, he took a step back and sighed, his voice heavy with frustration. "I can't believe how cold you're being. I thought you were better than this."
That broke me.
I felt my chest tighten, my breath hitch as I fought to keep my voice steady. "Cold," I said, barely above a whisper. You think I'm cold because I won't let you steamroll over me and the kids? Do you even hear yourself? Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You didn't just betray me 9 years ago. You're betraying me now. You're betraying our kids by forcing this on them without a thought for how it might hurt them. And worst of all, you're betraying that little girl by bringing her into a home where you've made everyone feel like they have to fight for scraps of normalcy. His expression flickered, just for a moment, as though my words had hit something deep inside him. But the moment passed, and he shook his head. You're impossible, he muttered, turning and walking back to his room. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. Every emotion, anger, sadness, guilt, betrayal, swirled inside me like a storm I couldn't escape. By the time I finally retreated to my own room, the house felt colder than it ever had. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, wondering how we had gotten here. How did a life I'd built with so much care become this unrecognizable mess? I didn't sleep that night. The guilt gnawed at me, not for standing my ground, but for the innocent child caught in the crossfire. She didn't deserve this. None of us did. But it was my husband's choices that had turned all of us into collateral damage. Now I'm left questioning everything. Did I do the right thing? Was I cruel for refusing to force my daughter to share her room and her life with someone she barely knows? Or am I justified in protecting her, even if it means standing against my husband? So, AITA for refusing to let my daughter be the one who sacrifices everything while my husband's lies continue to unravel our lives? Lightbulb, your thoughts matter. Was I wrong? Or am I standing up for my family, the only way I know how? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell for the latest updates on gripping family dilemmas.